about what may be called the battle cry or rallying point. And I've read and talked to a lot of CEOs. Some of the most successful ones have had at one point or the other some rallying point or some battle cry that has led to successful. Howard Stern says, king of all media. He said, put on, put through, take off.
Yeah.
How important is a battle cry in a business?
I think it's important, but I think consistency of behavior is much more important. I think you tell your people, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And then you go forward, and if you do things afterwards out of expediency, and it's outside of kind of the principles that you base your decision on and the rationale that you use with your people to explain a decision, you lose a little credibility. And this consistency, adherence to the principles and the operating philosophy of the company, I think is way more important than, a cliche. Ultimately, people get tired of hearing about the same mantra, if you will.
Right.
So that it may get people excited temporarily, but I think it has a short shelf life. So I think what's way more important than that, and what I've always tried to do myself personally and instill upon the rest of the leaders of the organization, is these are our principles. This is our explanation for doing what we do, and we do not deviate from our principles. We may modify our strategy because the dynamics of the marketplace modify sometimes, but it's always modified against that foundation, that principled foundation, so that when we do make a change, people understand exactly why we did it. And it's not just, just this one time we're going to do something differently. So I think consistency and not giving in to the impulse to do something out of expediency is very important. And the other thing is, we don't chase growth. We think that as history tells us, that our growth range is between a low of X and a high of Y. And if we find ourselves trying to grow higher than Y, then typically that means we've compromised something. And so we're not too worried about what the rest of the world is doing. We want to grow at a rate, for example, the last 6 years or so before last year, we grew at a double-digit rate every year for like 5 or 6 years in a row. And low double-digit, like 10, 11%. We think that's, for us, that's the right number. And that's a pretty good number. If we try to go at 20, we'd have to compromise something to do that. And eventually the piper gets paid when you compromise things. So we try to avoid that.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that more important than the battle cry is this bedrock of incorrigible, incontrovertible sort of 3 or 4 really important principles that you behave upon, that is maybe visible to your immediate executive team, but not necessarily to everybody.
Well, we try and instill it throughout the organization, and of course, it's a fairly sizable company, and we operate in 54 countries around the world. And once you get outside of our headquarters conference room, then the message is not as explicitly delivered. But you try to be very consistent. You try to reinforce it every single time you can, whether you're speaking to a group or you're writing something or you're appearing in a video. You have to reinforce the message, and you have to act in a way that people expect you to act, because you've told them this is what you can expect from us, the leadership team. And you have to behave in that way. And when you do, then people develop a level of confidence, and then it's one less thing they have to worry about.
But are these principles across the board transferable? Are these consistent across businesses? Or is it something that you develop based on like a strategic plan of sorts? This year, this next two years, or for this kind of a business, customer loyalty is important. for another kind of business, maybe that's not the number one thing.
Exactly. Well, I think like anything else, you have to go what works for you. You have to go what you're comfortable with. We're not a command and control organization. We believe in giving people the freedom to act. We recruit great people. We give them the freedom to act. We don't second guess them. We don't look over their shoulder. Of course, they don't always get it right, but that's okay as long as we're, tracking pretty much in the way we want to go. And when they don't get it right, we teach them how to get it right the next time. So I'll give you a great example, and I think this is analogous to how we work here. Since 1981, I've been driving a very small, very fast German car. I've had 7 of them since 1981. And I was in Stuttgart, and the folks there were kind enough to arrange for me to have a private tour of the factory. And, you've seen how cars get built in Detroit. You got an engine block that goes by. The guy goes like this. The guy goes like this. That's what he does. He punches the clock at the beginning and the end of his 8-hour shift. He doesn't see the raw material at the one end, and he doesn't see the finished product at the other end. So it's very hard for him to understand what his contribution is on a daily basis. And it's very hard for him to feel a sense of ownership and accountability for how the organization performs. If you go to Stuttgart, Germany, to this particular car manufacturer I'm referring to, the first stop on the private tour was where the engine gets built. The engine gets built by one guy who takes that engine from the beginning when it's in its most raw state and walks this thing around kind of a serpentine conveyor belt. And at every station, he does something to it. It takes a normally aspirated engine, takes about an hour and 10 minutes to build. And at the end, that's his engine. And at this particular company, interesting story, they subject this engine to some ridiculous heat test. Like you drive the car at 200,000 miles at a constant speed of 150 miles an hour or something. Completely crazy. And I said to my guide, well, gee, that's a pretty tough test. He said, yes, it is. I said, you ever get an engine that fails? He said, yes, we get an engine that fails about 0.04% of the time. I said, wow, that's like nothing, but this is a pretty expensive car. What happens to the engineer that built the engine? He said, oh, well, we just give him some more training.
Yes.
That's the right idea. And that's the way we try to operate here as well.
And that's why I think it's very important to understand. And that's why it's very important to understand these principles that people try to learn from each other oftentimes as we go in our life and career. And sometimes we take analogies and apply it incorrectly. So my goal is to really get into the depth of it and see how to really think about it. What are the confounding variables? How to change the next layer. You give an example of this, the German car, and then there's the Italian car, and Lamborghini, and how they do things is vastly different from certainly Detroit, but also Germany. They pretty much do everything by themselves. So it works for them. There's no way you can take one model and impose it up into the situation.
I think, my theory is in any organization, it's the leader who sets the tone, his personality, what he wants from the organizational culture, whether or not the leader is smart enough to know that if you don't create a culture creates an avoid, and what he thinks is going to work for him. And the organization takes their cue from the leader and the leadership. And I've gathered people around me who think the way I do. I mean, they're not yes men, but we have the same philosophical outlook on what's the best way to run an organization. So it works for us. It works for us. I'm my personality, and somebody else might be somebody else's personality.
And the thing is, you've grown consistently in the same domain, and you have the depth of knowledge, which many others who jump from one domain to the others would possibly lack. And sometimes people are successful by serendipity, but they don't realize it, and others don't realize it. I mean, I don't know if Snapchat is one of those, but I don't think it's a replicable success model.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of people like that.
Well, I think one of the things that we don't do well as leaders of businesses is we don't question success. We try to evaluate why we might have failed in a certain situation and try to learn from that, but we don't success. When we have it, we just go, wow, that's great, and we take it for granted. And sometimes success isn't success. Sometimes it's very fleeting.
Yeah, and also it hides a lot of mistakes just because nobody will question it. And you don't know what element of luck was part of it. And that's one of the reasons I try to talk to people who have been seriously successful as opposed to all of a sudden they just spark and try to be popular at, hotmail.com. You never know what really happened to it.
Right. Well, if you read the book, you know that my basketball coach that I played for in high school said, you never get too high in victory and you never get too low in defeat. It means you want to be kind of steady as you go, and you want to try to avoid these spikes, because when you're up there, it's euphoric, and when you're down there, it's terrible. So you try to keep everybody is subject to the vagaries of the business cycle, but you try to keep everything within a range and a manageable kind of feeling throughout the organization. And again, it's a lot of, especially in financial services, we don't import or export anything. We don't have R&D. It's a cliche, but we really are a people business. And so if the people have the confidence that the leadership is positioning them to win, and they've seen it happen consistently, and that kind of reinforces it, that's a pretty good situation. That's the way we try to run it here.
Well, one last question. You wanted to be a lawyer at one point, although you're very close to being a lawyer if I get the business right. But not shifting the domain and staying on course, which you espouse, and I think it's a great idea to learn to grow in something that is a mature market and you become really deep in it. But do you think that that's a good policy for people to follow as they get out of school or they're starting out their career? Or is it that you should switch from one domain to the other to gather depth of experience?